Hello! How should the war in Ukraine make us rethink the world order? For the past few years, Radio 4's Rethink has invited many of the world's most original and influential thinkers to fundamentally rethink the way we live now in light of a once-in-a-century pandemic. We've published audio essays on almost every aspect of our lives and run major series on fairness, education, and demography, all of them very much available online. Today, we are living with, rather than through, COVID-19. In this post-pandemic era, war has returned to Europe, and the echoes of history are strong. For some, the Donbass today is a replay of the Sudetenland in 1939. For others, tensions with Russia and indeed China herald a return to the geopolitical bipolarity of the Cold War. And most historians would accept that the 500 years or so in which the West ruled the world through empires and then nation states is, if not over, perhaps in abeyance or even retreat. In this new era, power has shifted irretrievably to the east and south, even as Western alliances such as NATO have been revived by events in Ukraine. And something resembling the world's first hoodie-clad and turtle-necked oligarchy has emerged in hippie California through Silicon Valley. It is a fascinating, complex picture of accelerated change and instability, and we intend to be your guide. This week, we're going to examine how we need to rethink aid and humanitarianism, ask whether the future of war looks a lot like its past, and interrogate the role of energy in an era of disruption and climate change. But today, we start with an even bigger canvas, because if we are living through one of the epochal shifts that our species occasionally indulges, perhaps history should be our guide in plotting a new world order. And for this opening program, we have an exceptionally eminent and capable panel. First of all, we've got Professor Niall Ferguson, the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I think he's the author now of about 18 books, including Empire, The Pity of War, and most recently, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. He's, of course, a former Reith lecturer at the BBC. Anne Applebaum is a journalist and historian. She's written extensively about the history of communism and the development of civil society in Central and Eastern Europe, and her books include Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. She joins us from Warsaw in Poland. Professor Rana Mitter is joining us from New Orleans. He's the Professor of History and Politics of Modern China and the Director of the University of Oxford China Center, and also a Fellow of St. Cross College. And Andrei Kortunov is the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council and joins us from Moscow. Thank you all very, very much indeed for making time. I want to start by asking you all the same question. How should we rethink the world order in light of Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine? Anne Applebaum.
I think the answer to that question is going to depend on how the war ends. I think it's too early to answer it. There are too many contingencies. What the war is a clash between two very different political systems and two very different theories of international relations. Do we respect the borders of states? Do we try to resolve conflict through negotiation? Do we assume that each state, as it exists now, has the right to sovereignty? Or do we revert to a previous era of colonialism and imperialism when larger states get to dictate, not just the foreign policy, but even the domestic policy and the identity of smaller states? That's what's at stake in this war. The first view that I described has been the view of Europe and the United States, of the European Union, of the transatlantic alliance for the last several decades. The question is now whether Russia can succeed in challenging that world order and that way of seeing the world. And if it does so successfully, will others follow it?
Thank you, Anne. Andrei Kortunov.
If I might add, I think a lot really depends on the outcome of the conflict because it might appear as a kind of deviation from the normal course of things, as a blip on our radar screen. And the national system might finally turn out to be resilient enough to absorb this shock and to continue as it goes right now. Or this tragic war is a symptom of something much bigger, something that will change the rules of the game completely and will destroy the world order the way we know it.
Andrei, thank you. Professor Niall Ferguson, same question to you. How should we rethink the world order in light of Russia's reinvasion?
Well, world order is one of these phrases that perhaps gets overused. It's been around for just over a century, it's fallen into some disrepute. In fact, many of the conspiracy theories that you'll encounter on the internet actually revolve around the notion of a new world order. My own view is that it's probably more useful to talk about the liberal international order, a phrase associated with the institutions that were established after World War II, which it's often argued were designed to create a new system based on international and indeed supranational entities, the United Nations, obviously, but a whole bunch of other institutions that have subsequently evolved. Clearly, it's, as Anne Applebaum rightly says, a major challenge to that liberal international order that Russia is seeking to invade Ukraine in violation of international law, apparently seeking some kind of 18th or 19th century style partition of the country. But I think it might be just as useful to put this in a different context. We might consider what's happening right now as one of the early phases of Cold War II. Now, in Cold War II, the Soviet Union's been replaced by the People's Republic of China as the major player on the other side, on the anti-American, anti-democratic side. But in a way, that works quite well as an analogy, because just as the Korean War was the first hot war of Cold War I think the Ukraine war is the first hot war of Cold War II.
Rana Mitter, same question to you. How should we rethink the world order, if such a thing makes sense, given what Niall's just said, in light of Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine?
Well, I think one of the things that it will affect is one of the other big mega stories that is shaping global order, and that is the rise of China. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in various contexts during the course of our conversation. Just in the context of the Ukraine war, I think that there is a negative and a positive, you might say, from the Chinese point of view. The negative is that China's top priority at the moment, post-COVID, is to try and reinvigorate its own economy. That's difficult, actually, partly because China is one of the few countries left in the world right now that has quarantine regulations still on people coming in and out of the country. So a relatively quiet world, a world in which economic activity geared up, and there wasn't too much turbulence, will be much better from China's point of view. But there are positives in terms of the changing world order from China's point of view. And I'd say the two major ones. First, in terms of Russia itself, there is, I think, a strong sense growing that over the medium term, there are a variety of areas where China would like to have a greater presence. Those might include areas such as the Arctic, as climate change begins to change the way in which northern waterways can be traversed by shipping, or indeed the question of outer space. And Russia has a real presence in these areas, and I wouldn't be surprised to see China pressuring Russia more in its own interests in those particular ungoverned spaces. The other area where I think in terms of global order, we're going to see more influence from China in the next year or two or three is in what some call the global south. In other words, the emergent countries and markets of Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, and South and East Asia. Because as China continues to portray itself as a major economic power, and the liberal order, the Western world that we tend to think of as the West, is doing more in terms of getting sucked into how to resolve the Ukraine crisis, that gives China more of a blank canvas and open space to be able to pursue its own interests in other parts of the world.
Neil, I want to start by asking you and Anne about a couple of historic parallels, if I may, because we can't understand the New World Order, such as it may or may not be, without understanding the old one. And you've written quite a lot about how the US today, America today, resembles Britain of the 1920s. Can you just expand a bit on why you think that's an instructive and useful comparison?
Well, Americans like to make historical analogies with America. They nearly always are asking themselves, what part of US history are we rerunning? But actually, I think for much of the 20th century, the United States finds itself rather as Britain did in the interwar period, with a great many commitments, global commitments, not only in the Far East, not only in Europe, but also, let's not forget, the Middle East. Its defense budget is being squeezed, and there's a deep division about the role of the United States, which does recall to me the predicament of Britain in the 20s and 30s. Empire is not a word Americans use. They like hegemony or primacy, but it really doesn't matter what you call it. If you are the number one power with military deployments, military assets all over the world, you are functionally, from the point of view of the rest of the world, playing an imperial role. And most Americans are very uncomfortable about that. On the right, as well as on the left, there's been a sustained critique of empire 20 years ago, I was writing about this in books like Empire and Colossus, making the argument that it was highly unlikely that the United States would be able to sustain that kind of global imperial role for some of the reasons that proved a source of weakness for Britain. And I think that's the right way to think about the US today. And that's dangerous because, of course, Britain's overextension in the mid-20th century made it highly vulnerable to challenges. I think Americans need to think about that analogy. It's not perfect, no historical analogy is, but it seems a better guide to where the US is than some of the analogies that one hears bandied about.
Neil, thank you very much indeed. While we're talking about the 20th century, and you wrote a very influential essay in The Atlantic last November with the headline, "The Bad Guys Are Winning." Its central argument, I should say some months before Vladimir Putin reinvaded Ukraine. And its central argument, if I'm not mistaken now, was that the 20th century was at its core the advance of liberal democracy, the retreat of various totalitarianisms, communism, fascism, nationalism. But in the 21st century, that's going into reverse. This was really part of the argument in your book, Twilight of Democracy, which you and I have discussed before. Could you just expand on that, please, and the evidence that you adduce for that argument?
So the argument there was not that we are now engaged in a new Cold War or that there's a single ideological threat coming from one kind of authoritarianism that threatens liberal democracy. It was actually that we're in a very different kind of era. We're in an era when there are different kinds of autocracies, theocratic, nationalist, communist, different kinds of communists. The Cubans call themselves communists. The Chinese call themselves communists, different kinds of regimes in different places, but that they have commonly begun to perceive the liberal democratic world, by which I mostly mean Europe and the United States, but also includes, in some cases, South America. They've begun to see that world as their most important enemy. Most of these regimes their primary foreign policy interest is in preserving their own power. And they see the language of democracy and the language of fairness and justice as the primary challenge to their rule. And so they have begun to work together in various ways, sometimes not in a terribly coordinated way. So there is no room full of Illuminati. There's no James Bond movie where all the bad guys sit in one room and make decisions. But they do collaborate in various ways now designed to help one another. And of course, we can see that in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the Chinese haven't been openly involved, but neither are they willing to put sanctions on Russia. Neither are they willing to pull back from their support of Russia in other ways. You can see it in other ways as well. Why has the Venezuelan regime, which is one of the weakest autocratic regimes in the world with very little popular support, why has it managed to stay in power? Partly because of Chinese and Russian investment, partly because of Iranian investment, partly because of Cuban support in terms of their surveillance technology, and also in the United Nations and in other bodies. So these regimes have begun to help one another and to support one another around the world in order to keep themselves in power. The liberal world has not really understood this as a threat, hasn't really defined it that way, has trouble understanding that the ways in which these different countries work together, and doesn't really have a strategy yet for pushing back against it. It's not as if, democracy versus autocracy even really explains the nature of the conflict that we live in. But we are in an era when autocracies have found new ways to stay in power, new ways to push back against both domestic and international enemies, new language to do that, and they look for allies with one another and inside the liberal world as well.
Okay, I want to ask, thank you very much indeed, and I want to ask Rana Mitter and Andrei Kortunov what they make of that thesis. And actually, I want to start with you, Andrei, and the view from Moscow.
Well, I would generally agree to this analysis. Indeed, we see coalitions that cut across borders and sometimes political groups in many countries. Definitely, if you look at the situation from the Kremlin and arguably from Beijing, they would offer a different borderline in the world politics. They would probably say that the real dividing line is not between autocracies and democracies, but rather between order and disorder. And if you happen to support disorder, be it in the Middle East or elsewhere, you are on the wrong side of history. If you stand for order, even this order might be imperfect and authoritarian, but you are still on the right side. So that is, I think, the vision that you can see coming from the East, including major authoritarian states opposing the West. However, I think that indeed, if we are thinking about what might happen within the next couple of years, a lot will depend on the cohesion of the West, whether the current integrity of the Western world is going to survive the Ukrainian crisis and is going to extend beyond Russia to other problems of the international system. Depending on whether it is situational, tactical, or strategic, we might see very different outcomes of the current movement. And arguably, indeed, if the West is able to maintain its integrity, some elements of the situation of turn of the century might be resurrected. So we would see a restoration of a unipolar world order. However, if this cohesion is not maintained, if we see centrifugal trends dominating the Western world, we might see a revolution in the international system in the sense that some of the existing institutions, procedures, and legal norms will become dated and will continue to decay. So I think that it is still an open question and the jury is still in session.
Okay. Andre, thank you very much indeed. Rana Mitter.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes the current way in which China thinks about the changing order very different from the old Cold War is that it's operating on almost exactly the opposite principle. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you think about the classic Cold War, the one that Neil talked about a bit earlier on, between the United States and the Soviet Union, both of those countries had a vision of what the world was supposed to look like if their version of order prevailed. For the Americans, essentially liberal democracy around the world. For the Soviets, forms of, the kind of people's democratic dictatorships or some version of a Marxist-Leninist operation around the world. China is doing something very different today. It is operating on the basis that at home in China, in its immediate backyard, there is a very strong ideological vision of what society should be like. But unlike in the Cold War, China argues that only China can actually operate that system at home. And its very genuine desire for major global influence outside its own backyard is almost entirely expressed in economics and to some extent military terms. So at home, China actually has a very strong ideological vision of what it wants to do. It's a very strange hybrid mix, very interesting, very original, of what you might call classic Marxist thinking, ideas of contradiction, ideas of struggle, terms which in the Western world tend not to be heard very much. They were very popular in the 70s and 80s, perhaps, but not really since the end of the Cold War, combined with a traditional view of Chinese philosophy, the philosophy of Confucius and other thinkers, that's supposed to basically give a new kind of identity to the China of today. But once you get outside that backyard of China, its immediate periphery, it's much more interested in using things like technology. For instance, past dependency on the rollout of 5G technology in places like sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. That looks much more like classic realist economic and to some extent military influence. There isn't any real interest, I think, in China in trying to spread some sort of Chinese-influenced ideology in those sorts of places.
That's fascinating. Can I just go back to Andrei Kortunov on a similar point? Andrei, Rana Mitter used the idea there of a periphery, the tensions at the edges, if you like. To what extent do you think, Andrei, that Vladimir Putin has a worldview, which is that we're returning really to a kind of late 19th century world where you have competing great powers who spread their influence in these diminishing concentric circles of influence, and it's where those circles of influence clash, Ukraine, maybe Taiwan, that we're likely to see conflict?
I think that this view is something that has a lot of mileage in the Kremlin. The question is how far they can go with this idea. For instance, Russia somehow tolerates the growing Chinese influence in Central Asia. It tolerates the Turkish presence in the South Caucasus. It is mostly about the Western influence along the Western periphery of the Soviet Union, which the Kremlin leadership is so opposed to. But even here, we see some nuances. I think with time, Russia is become a little bit more tolerant towards the European Union's influence in its neighborhood. But it is emphatically opposed to any military presence of the West, especially if this presence is associated with the NATO alliance.
Okay, I want to talk explicitly and clearly about Taiwan in this very context, if I may. Neil, as I understand it, you're working on your next volume of your biography of Henry Kissinger, which I think addresses the 1970s. He's in fact just given a an interview to Radio 4 from his home in America, in which he expressed his profound concern about the potential catastrophic consequences of this current military buildup in Taiwan. What's your assessment of whether Taiwan could be the next expression of China's ambition, and whether or not it marks the end of America's empire or hegemony, or whatever we want to call it?
Well, Taiwan is the key. And in the end, it's of much greater importance than Ukraine in economic terms.
Why?
But I think also in the context. Because the most important and most cutting edge semiconductor manufacturing that Taiwan has in the form of TSMC, it's also clearly the case that if the US and China came to blows or even close to blows over Taiwan, the economic consequences would be hugely disruptive, much more disruptive, even the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I don't think it matters, to address something Rana Mitter just said, that China is less keen on exporting its ideology than the Soviet Union was. Because in the end, Taiwan's on the shopping list of Xi Jinping, and it's right up at the top of the shopping list, regardless of ideology, except in one respect, that what is objectionable in Beijing is that Taiwan is currently modeling successful democracy amongst a Chinese population. And it's the same problem that, just to go to Andrei's point, that Russia has with Ukraine. The problem with Ukraine is that Ukraine is trying to be a liberal democracy right on Russia's doorstep. And in that sense, there is an ideological division. That's why it is like a Cold War. I think Anne Applebaum's essay on the kleptocratic enemy was an extremely important contribution. And I think it's a good way of thinking about Cold War II, that in a sense, what really counts here is that there is a kind of rogues version of the Warsaw Pact, which bonds together a rather motley crew of regimes. The People's Republic of China is clearly the senior dominant partner, but there's also Russia, there's Venezuela, let's not forget North Korea, and let's not forget Iran. We're not talking about the Middle East here, but we really shouldn't forget about it. If there's a crisis over Taiwan, the problem for the United States will be that if it comes very soon, it's going to be very, very difficult for the United States to make a credible response. Taiwan is not ready to be Ukraine. It's not ready to defend itself with the tenacity that the Ukrainians have shown. I think it's important to point out that from the vantage point of Washington, Ukraine matters above all as a way of signaling to China, keep your hands off Taiwan. If you ask the question, why was it that the Biden administration was in no hurry to stop the war, didn't make any effort to try to force the two sides to reach a ceasefire agreement? The answer is because they believed that letting the war run would bleed Russia dry, maybe lead to regime change in Moscow, which I always thought was pretty fanciful, but crucially, send a signal to Xi Jinping, don't mess with Taiwan because the West can still get its act together, and you don't want to be dealing with this on your own doorstep. If the United States and China have a showdown over Taiwan, it will be the Cuban Missile Crisis of our time, with a very significant probability of escalation to nuclear exchanges, as Robert Blackwill and Philip Zelikow have argued, as many people have argued who've looked at this problem. The United States, I don't think, can deter China at the moment. And if it's confronted with a Chinese invasion, will be an extremely dangerous territory, much more dangerous territory than over Ukraine.
Neil, thank you. And can I pick up one of the central points of what Neil's just said, which is the idea that the US is not ready for Taiwan. It's not in a position to act. On the one hand, today, you've got the moral and military exhaustion of the West. We saw in Kabul, for instance, the West is hugely indebted. There's an aging population. There's immense polarization, such that some of these Western countries are becoming close to ungovernable. On the other hand, Ukraine has really revived NATO, hasn't it? How do you assess the health of the West today, Anne?
So I'm with you in that I've spent a lot of time worrying about Western decline. I don't think that the West has really even now fully taken on board what it means to have a country like Russia sharing the continent with Europe, a country that wishes the European Union to be dissolved, that wants NATO to be broken up, that wants the United States to leave the continent, and that genuinely believes that it will inflict its political system on Ukraine and perhaps on Poland and perhaps on the Baltic states and even perhaps further than that sometime in the future. And the lack of imagination in Western Europe in particular, but also in Washington. And as Neil has just said, there's an even greater gap in our thinking about how will we deal with a China that begins to think or behave anyway along those lines as well. Are we really prepared for a war that are, over and over again, war games show we can't win? Do we have a different strategy? Have we thought about what it would mean to lose Taiwan, what the significance of that would be for Japan, for South Korea, for our other allies in that region, and for stability in that whole, in all over Asia? And I don't think we have faced up to that. And one of the reasons we don't face up to it is because there's so much polarization and anger inside our political systems, particularly inside the American system, that we're almost incapable of it. The war in Ukraine has had an interesting impact on that. One, because it has, in a strange way, had an impact on the culture war inside the United States. So if you think very, very crudely of the American culture war being sort of liberal values on the one hand and nationalism or patriotism on the other hand, and there's some kind of conflict between those two things, one of the things the Ukrainians have shown us is that they don't have to be in conflict. You can have a patriotic, nationalistic defense of liberal values, which is what Zelensky articulates several times a day sometimes. And the unity that you've seen inside the US around that cause, at least up until now, is a heartening sign that if we had leadership that was able to define goals, we might be able to get some strategic thinking or some long-term thinking back again. I am also heartened by the NATO involvement in the conflict, in particularly by the Swedish and Finnish decisions to join NATO, because that shows that there is still a belief in the power of working together. There is still a belief in that sense in the liberal world order that we were talking about earlier.
Well,
Can I just say,
so go ahead,
to add to that, how much what Anne's just said illustrates the power of the Cold War analogy, because we're not talking here about the institutions of the liberal international order. In fact, the UN Security Council became a scene of entire farce on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We're talking about NATO, we're talking about American alliances and how far they can work to contain an aggressive Russia and, of course, to contain an increasingly assertive China. The other thing that makes me feel this is the right analogy is just the fact of nuclear weapons. I mean, one can, of course, listen to President Putin as he fantasizes so charmingly about being Peter the Great. And I think it's certainly true, as Andrei said, that that's much more important in his imagination. There's a difference, and the difference is that he's resurrecting the Russian Empire with the nuclear legacy of the Soviet Union. And you can't have a discussion about world order that overlooks the extraordinary importance of nuclear weapons. Why is Ukraine currently a battlefield? Why is it in many cities a pile of rubble? Because it gave up its nuclear weapons. What is the issue in the Middle East? That Iran is trying to acquire nuclear weapons. We can't escape the reality that if there is anything resembling a world order at the moment, it's actually the world disorder of a gradual disintegration of the system of nuclear non-proliferation that dates back to 1968. And as it becomes clear that having no nukes exposes you to this kind of aggression, the race will be on to acquire nuclear weapons all around the world.
Well, I'm very glad you went there because I wanted to.
Can I just push back briefly on Taiwan, if I may?
Sure.
I take the point that Neil and Anne have made, but I think that actually the danger is regarding the Taiwan question as if it's purely a US-China issue that's isolated from the rest of the region and the rest of the global order. One of the things that, first of all, needs to be done in terms of a Chinese plan, if it were going to make a military assault on Taiwan, is to prepare large numbers of troops, which would be very, very visible on the coast of China. And after Ukraine, I think it's clear that the rest of the world would regard any type of troop gathering of that sort as a sign that something was up. So it wouldn't be possible to do it simply overnight. But overall, it's worth noting that the region, the Asia-Pacific region, which is now one of the major economic and security hubs of the world, would have an awful lot to say about all of this. We mentioned Japan briefly. Japan's former Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, has indicated very clearly that not just the United States, but the many allies in the region, and also countries which are more inclined towards supporting the current regional order, would find any assault on Taiwan a really unacceptable part of changing the order. And Japan's made it very clear it's a major issue for them. Finally, it's worth noting that the economic links that bind together the Asia-Pacific region are something that China really, really finds central to one of its key goals, which is basically getting its economy back on track.
But do the multilateral institutions that emerged from the Second World War, the IMF that came out of Bretton Woods, the United Nations, Rana, do those institutions strike the leaders in Beijing as basically a Western imposition?
Well, I think there are two things that come from that, Amol. One is that many of those institutions are being reshaped by China in directions which it finds more amenable. So, for instance, if you think about institutions like the International Telecommunications Union, things like whether or not the internet is going to be more easily controlled within national boundaries, particularly by authoritarian regimes such as China or Russia, that's something that China is very keen to do within the existing structures, but by reshaping them. The Human Rights Council of the United Nations would be another example of exactly that. But there are also a variety of other areas where actually the picture is more mixed because it's to do with institutions that are emerging even now and are being shaped. Take something like ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which actually is an organization which is really important in China's own backyard in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of Chinese influence there, clearly, not least because China's a major economic partner for pretty much every country in Asia. But on issues such as China's attempts to try and assert its right over the whole of the South China Sea, a really important maritime issue for China, there's still plenty of pushback from other actors in the region, Vietnam, Philippines, and so forth, precisely because they realize that actually new institutions are needed to make sure that China doesn't simply turn the whole of the Asia-Pacific into an area with only one hegemonic power, which would be China.
I'm acutely conscious that we've not only is it Iran that, as Neil mentions, we've not really expanded on at great length, but we've not yet mentioned the land of my birth, India. But Andre, I do want in this context, talking about the multilateral institutions that currently maintain something resembling world order or world disorder, to get your view from Moscow. What does a constructive relationship with Russia look like?
Well, let me start with saying that it has always been difficult for big countries to engage in multilateral institutions. Big countries like the Russian Empire or the United States or China always preferred to deal with their partners or adversaries in the bilateral format, or they preferred to take unilateral actions because they were simply stronger than their neighbors and their partners. Even if you take multilateral institutions after the Second World War, most of them were asymmetrical in the sense that in cases of NATO or EBRD or International Monetary Fund, the US influence has been predominant. So right now, the question is whether these powers can master the ability to operate within multilateral institutions. As far as Russia is concerned, de facto, it has been already excluded from most of multilateral institutions, even the most successful ones, like the Arctic Council or the Council of Baltic Sea States. It is no longer part of the Council of Europe. So there'll be a pause, and we don't know how long this pause is likely to last for, but the odds are that Russia will be at least half isolated in the international system. It will still practice multilateralism within non-Western institutions, but it will take a long time before Russia is allowed to play a role in these multilateral institutions with the major Western presence.
Andre, thank you. In the time that we have left, and I do want to ask you about another center of power in the 21st century, which is broadly defined as cyberspace, the digital domain, what Mark Zuckerberg calls the fifth estate, because Silicon Valley companies are often in conflict or tension with American or Western governments, whereas in China, the big tech companies like Alibaba are almost subsidiaries of the regime. Do you think, Anne, that presents a vulnerability for the West, the fact that there is this new center of power which is not under democratic control?
It does present a lot of different kinds of vulnerabilities to which there's no easy answer. In your question, you indicated one of the, you pointed the way towards one of the emerging problems in even having a single conversation about this, which is that, in China, the tech companies that work closely with the Chinese government, but not only do the Western companies now not work closely with Western governments, they increasingly are not going to be able to work in Russia or China either, because they're going to be excluded, because the rules of the game there are going to make it impossible for them to function, because they're going to be excluded by sanctions, whatever the reasons are. And so increasingly, we're going to have a divided world where the rules are very different in different places. One of the strange things about the tech world and its coexistence on the democratic half of that conversation is the degree to which the democratic countries have in effect allowed the tech companies to set their own rules, which has been very beneficial economically, and which has also, in some cases, resulted in terrible undermining of and conflicts within democracies. Even one very simple piece of that story, which is the Facebook algorithm, which we all know now amplifies emotion and anger and division, is something that Facebook created. It was done for commercial purposes. And it seemed that still has never been possible for democratic countries even to have a say in how that algorithm is run or how it's managed. Having the democracies work together to discuss that, to make sure that the tech companies don't undermine our own political systems, is absolutely crucial, while at the same time we want to encourage these companies to develop and to grow. It's actually not even a conversation that's begun yet in the West. A little bit inside the European Union, there's conversation at least about how to make the online world more compatible with democracy, more useful to democracy, and it's not even begun yet.
And thank you so much, Neil. I just want to pick up on this point about a network world with you briefly, because you wrote about this in the Square and the Tower. One of the points you make in that book, you've made elsewhere, is that one of the defining features of modern life really is this tremendous acceleration in change brought about by technology.
I think it's really important to recognize that the structural change in the public sphere that has happened with the advent of the internet, and particularly the rise of network platforms, alters the historical process as profoundly as the advent of the printing press in the late 15th century. And this makes analogies of the sort that we've been playing around with the mid-20th century slightly problematic. In the mid-20th century, for most of the Cold War, there was still quite centralized control over communications and media. And that's broken down in our time. And the parallel, I think, is a good one if you think about what happened in the wake of the dissemination of the printing press. You had not a kind of harmonious society, but a profoundly divided one. 130 years or so of religious conflict ensued after the Reformation, culminating in the 30 Years' War, which is almost the definition of a breakdown of international order. It was a period of near anarchy in Europe. That's, I think, the nightmare scenario, that in our time, we don't even manage Cold War II. Because just to be clear, Cold War is not a bad outcome if the alternatives are A, World War III, or B, the 30 Years' War, a complete descent into chaos. We do live in a profoundly altered world because of the internet and network platforms. These things erode national sovereignty. They make it very, very easy for people to operate and exert influence across borders.
Rana, I wonder if I could ask you just to reflect on that point about technology, and then I'll go around the panel, as it were, for a final thought.
Yeah, I'd say that one of the greatest challenges for the next decade is the advances that are being made in China in artificial intelligence in particular, because the norms, particularly on the ethics of artificial intelligence, that are emerging in a state where obviously the boundaries between the private and the public sector are extremely blurred, and where essentially the state has control, are just very different from the ones that would emerge in Silicon Valley or most of the liberal world. And since China is almost certain to be one of the 2 or 3 major technology powers in the world in the next 20, 30 years, it's really important for both sides to understand what those ethical debates are about.
Rana, thank you. Let's finish by looking at let's say the decade ahead. If we take the advice of this panel and rethink the world order or disorder according to the recommendations that you've made, what do citizens of the West need to do above all to prepare for the new world order?
Take seriously the threat of autocracy, both external and internal. Begin to build systems of deterrence, both military and otherwise. Take seriously the influence of the autocratic world inside the democratic world, whether it's financial or whether it's political, and begin to think about how the democratic world can reform its institutions. And here I mean country by country, but also internationally. What are the military, economic, and other institutions that we need that will be fit for purpose for the new challenges in the 21st century?
Professor Niall Ferguson, same question to you. How should citizens of democracies in the West prepare for the decade ahead?
Well, first, let's come out of denial. We are in something like a second Cold War, and that's very risky and dangerous. The second thing that I think follows from that is don't fall victim to the kind of Red Scare psychology that could lead to a major disaster. I strongly favor skipping the Cuban Missile Crisis phase of Cold War II and going straight to détente.
Much appreciated. Andrei Kortunov.
Well, my advice would be to think about what will come after next 10 years. Next 10 years are likely to be characterized by the conflict between the East and the West in this or that form. But if we take a longer-term perspective, I think it will be more about the conflict or some kind of accommodation between the global North and the global South. And he who wins the hearts and the minds of the global South will have the upper hand, even in the conflict between the East and the West. And this is something that should be kept in mind.
Rana Mitter.
Two things, really. For Western audiences, first of all, have faith and rebuild liberal institutions, free media, diversity and dissent without descending into screaming matches, and also having faith and pride in issues like the independence of the judiciary and institutions rather than tearing them down. These are things that liberal societies have not been good at in the last 10 to 15 years, and they should relearn them. And the other thing, everyone in the West needs to learn more about the biggest authoritarian power that will be around with us for the next 25 to 30 years or more, and that is China. If you don't know about who China's leaders are, find out. If you don't know what everyday conversations are in China about major social issues, from feminism to environmental issues to climate change, find out that. In other words, we're not going to always agree with China, in fact, very infrequently perhaps in this new world, but we need to know more about how China works to be able to make our own decisions in the liberal world.
Well, and Rana, you're going to be a key part of that. Thank you very much indeed, Rana Mitter. And thank you very much indeed to all my superb guests, Niall Ferguson, Rana Mitter, Anne Applebaum, and Andrei Kortunov. In the next episode, we discuss how we can rethink humanitarian aid. Goodbye.